Okay, I'm here with Professor Eswar Prasad, Professor of Trade Policy at Cornell University. Welcome to Colombia.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Okay, let me start with the question that everyone is asking. You know, our clients ask that question all the time. What's going to happen with Europe? What's going to happen specifically right now? What's going to happen with Greece? Is there going to be an exit of Greece from the Eurozone in the short term? And if it happens, what could be the ramifications of such an event?
I think it's increasingly untenable, both economically and politically, for Greece to remain in the Eurozone. They've already undergone a lot of pain, but they don't have very much to show for it. In the best case scenario, if they do everything that the European Union and the IMF want them to do, they will still end up with an economy that is not very competitive, that has a debt burden of about 130% of GDP, and I think it's just not going to work very well. The other question, of course, is whether Germany is willing to continue funding Greece. And the reality is that right now it would require Germany to write a big check to Greece and to continue writing big checks, and I don't think there is a stomach for this in Germany. The big question, of course, is if Greece is going to exit, which I think is a fairly high probability event, when does it happen and how does it happen? Ideally, I think European policymakers would like to continue pushing this off until they have fortified the firewalls around the other distressed economies. Spain in particular has come under a lot of pressure recently, but there are other peripheral economies that are very vulnerable as well. The problem is that markets are not in a mood to give European policymakers the sort of time they need. They're testing the peripheral economies already, and my sense is that although Europe would like to push off the day of reckoning until later this year or possibly even early next year, it could happen much sooner. And if it happens sooner, and if there aren't strong fortifications around the rest of the Eurozone other than Greece, it's going to spell a lot of trouble for the peripheral economies, and it could infect some of the core economies as well in the short term. And of course, it would have spillover effects on the rest of the world. So I'm much less optimistic now than I was a few months ago when I thought it could be pushed off until the end of the year. I think the chances that Greece will exit the Eurozone by the end of the year are pretty high. I'd say well over 50%.
Oh, 50%, that's a lot. Because the concern that people have is, so basically you're saying it could be by the end of this year or maybe in the first few months of 2013. But, you know, taking also something that you just said, it doesn't seem like those firewalls are going to be ready by then. I mean, it seems very difficult that in the next 6 or 7 or 8 months, Europe will have those firewalls. So the real concern here is when it comes to the markets, if Greece exits the euro, the contagion effect on world markets could be really worrisome. I mean, some people are even talking that it could have a ramification similar to what happened with Lehman Brothers. So do you think that maybe the Eurozone should just do whatever it can to try to avoid something like that happening in the near term? And, you know, if it happens in 5 years, maybe that's a different story. But in the near term, do you think it might have such an implication to the world financial markets?
The repercussions could be severe, not so much through direct linkages. If you take US banks, for instance, the direct exposure to Europe is not very large right now. Some of the reinsurers in the US, I'm told, have a fair amount of exposure to Europe still. But overall, the US financial system is not directly exposed. But still, there could be fairly significant effects on the US banking system if worries about the European banking system infect the US banking system. And this is true of banking systems around the world. Now, one question one might ask is, if we can see this problem coming, that that Greece will eventually exit the Eurozone with some degree of messiness, why doesn't it happen right now if we can all see this coming? And I think the simple answer is the ECB. Markets, and I think most investors feel that world financial markets got burnt so badly by what happened to Lehman and other events during the global financial crisis, that central banks will step in a very forceful way if in fact there were to be a calamity. So I suspect that this faith that the European Central Bank and other global central banks, especially the Fed and the BOJ, will step in a massive way if this sort of event were to occur, I think give markets some sense of reassurance and perhaps will soften the blow, but it is going to be a pretty significant blow nevertheless.
Do you foresee the European Central Bank doing something in the second half of this year? The reason why I'm asking you is this. Last year, the European Central Bank decided to come up with a three-year the three-year loans to banks, because at that time, sovereign spreads were extremely high, and bank spreads were also very high, but also interbank conditions were really tight. Today, if you look at sovereign spreads, they're also high, maybe even higher than what they were back in November or December. Bank credit spreads are more or less same issue at the same levels of December. Interbank market has not been infected so much in the past couple of months as it was back in December. So, maybe the European Central Bank does not see that the banking situation right now is as bad as it was back in December. But the thing is that we're coming up to a Greek election in the middle of June, and then we're having the EU summit, plus Spain is going into disarray right now. So there's a good chance that those indicators will go back again to the similar levels that they were before, and then the European Central Bank will be forced to do something else.
Right. The European Central Bank, the ECB, knows that things are bad and they're going to get worse. But the reality the ECB faces is that it has a fair amount of firepower, but it wants to save that firepower for when things turn really bad. And of course, it's a very curious political dynamic within Europe, because Germany wants to push Greece to the brink, because unless Greece is pushed to the brink, there is a sense that they won't undertake the reforms they need. The European Central Bank wants European policymakers as a whole to be pushed to the brink, because unless that happens, there is a feeling that there won't be the sort of reforms that are needed in specific countries and also within the Eurozone more broadly. So it's a dangerous game at one level. On the one hand, one can argue that there is logic to the ECB holding on to some of its firepower and trying to push through reforms. But the problem again is that this could unravel very, very quickly and in a manner that makes it very difficult to forestall real disaster. So it's a difficult issue for the ECB again. Politically, they are in a bit of a bind because they have, in a sense, lost their virginity, because they have stepped into markets and there is the expectation that they're going to step in a lot more, which is sort of what's keeping things together right now. But if they act in a very forceful manner right now, that takes the pressure off the reforms. That pushes things a little further down the road and could lead to much worse outcomes further down the road. So I don't envy the ECB policymakers at this stage. They just have no easy choices facing them.
If you were an economic advisor to Angela Merkel, what would be your main advice to do right now?
So this cuts to the heart of the austerity versus growth debate, whether it makes sense right now to be pushing economies that are in deep trouble, that have a significantly falling GDP, to undertake significant austerity. Now the reality is that these countries do have to get their fiscal positions in order. So the question is just now or later. What would be ideal is if these economies could undertake some short-term stimulus policies, because aggregate demand is a serious problem right now, and commit to a long-term fiscal consolidation plan. The problem is that they have zero credibility. Not only have they not been able to come up with such a plan, even if they did come up with a plan, they would really have no credibility. So what's needed right now is to think about how to make these economies competitive. So one possibility is to try and front-load structural reforms. Let's take Greece as an example. There are lots of problems with their product and labor markets, and no matter what they do on the fiscal side, unless they tackle those problems, they're not going to make progress by improving competitiveness. So perhaps trying to put in place those measures will create some degree of credibility, some degree of space to go a little slower on the fiscal front. But right now, I don't see momentum to either undertake what's needed on the fiscal front or on the structural reform front. So we have, in a sense, the worst of all possible worlds. But again, if I was advising Angela Merkel, perhaps this sort of reorientation, a sort of policy reboot is what I would argue for.
And when it comes to this political gridlock that you're referring to, I'm actually going to jump to the United States right now, because they also have a political gridlock going on right now. They have elections this year, and the situation of the U.S., well, I mean, at least they're not shrinking, but growth is extremely moderate, and it's actually losing steam recently, especially also because what's happening in Europe. How do you foresee the role of the Federal Reserve? Because now we talked about the possibility that the ECB might eventually do something, or at least the expectation is there. But it seems that the expectation is also there for the Federal Reserve to do another round of quantitative easing. How do you foresee the situation for the U.S. going forward in the second semester of this year?
So the US did have promising economic outcomes in the last half of 2011, early in 2012, but that optimism has petered out. Financial markets did very well in the first part of this year. In the first 2 or 3 months, they have weakened. The employment position looked a lot better. The economy was generating about 175,000 jobs a month. The unemployment rate was falling. It fell to 8.1%. Consumer confidence had picked up, but all of that has really changed right now. Consumer confidence is no longer rising. It's falling quite significantly in the last month or so. Investment demand remains very weak. The employment growth has fallen to substantially lower levels, and the unemployment rate seems to have leveled off. So the US economy clearly is losing momentum. And that brings up the question of why and what policy tools can be used against it. On the why, my sense is that policy uncertainty is playing a hugely important role. In addition to the external uncertainty, there is the expectation that the shock from Europe may not have a huge effect, but at the margin it is going to hurt an already bruised economy. But the big concern is about the policy uncertainty, the political gridlock that you mentioned, the sense that nothing is really working on the fiscal front. And one of two things happens. Either at the end of this year, the fiscal cliff starts coming closer into view, and in fact, all the measures that will imply a very significant withdrawal of fiscal stimulus, the expiry of the tax cuts, many of the expenditure sequestrations, all of that is going to mean a very significant withdrawal of fiscal stimulus. The alternative scenario is where they basically say, let's just put off this whole thing for another year or so. And that's not a very good outcome either. So the feasible outcomes right now, given the political situation in Washington, all look very bad, either very bad now or very bad for the future. And that policy uncertainty, I think, is really hurting business confidence and consumer confidence. US corporations are sitting on massive amounts of cash, so it's not that they lack money to invest or that credit is a major problem right now, but there is just no appetite, especially among the big corporations, to invest. So I suspect that the US is a very vulnerable economy at this stage, and if there was a big shock from Europe, it could have a fairly significant effect on the US recovery.
Okay. The IMF is expecting that this year the European economy is going to shrink and the US is going to grow very low levels. And also there's a slowdown in emerging economies. But their numbers actually show that in 2013 those numbers are going to pick up a little bit. Not that we're going to go back to extremely strong growth, but it's going to be higher than this year. Do you buy that argument, and why?
I think it's more a hope than an unconditional forecast of what is likely to happen, because on current policies, and IMF forecast is supposed to be made on current policies, it's hard to see where exactly this growth is going to come from, especially if many of the risks that we talk about materialize. Of course, one might argue that this year might look a little worse than the IMF expects, and perhaps next year we'll have a bit of a rebound. But I suspect that right now it is optimism rather than anything else that is substantive that is carrying that forecast along. And I think the risks are across the board, and in particular the fact that industrial production growth has slowed down in virtually every major economy, either advanced or emerging, and the job situation in every economy looks pretty weak. I think doesn't provide much grounds for confidence.
Okay. You're an expert in China, and here in Colombia, where we are a commodity exporter, but the main concern inside Colombia is the price of oil, because of the importance that it has for the economy. And in the past month or so, oil prices have dropped significantly. So there's a concern, our clients have expressed concern as well, of how much can oil drop further from this point, and if that is going to pose a risk for the growth pattern here in Colombia. China obviously is a very important has a very important role in what happens in oil markets worldwide. What's your view on what's going to happen with oil prices? First, from the point of China, and second, from the point for what's happening in oil markets in general for the next few years.
Let's talk about China's growth, which I guess is going to have serious implications for oil demand and oil prices. The Chinese government has a growth target of 7.5% for this year, 2012. I'm fairly confident they will hit it. They're quite vulnerable to external shocks, especially because their two main export markets, the US and Europe, to which they send about 45% of their exports. Those markets are weak, are going to remain weak, but China has a lot of room in terms of policies. Just today they have cut interest rates. Their reserve requirements on banks are still at about 20%, so if they reduced required reserve ratio by 2 percentage points, that floods the economy with credit. They have a lot of room on fiscal policy. So in a year of leadership transition, I have little doubt that they will do what is needed in order to achieve the growth target. But the interesting question becomes, how are they going to do it? They can either use fiscal policy or monetary policy. Fiscal policy is something they would like to use more aggressively because it not only helps short-term growth, but also helps them in this long-term goal they have of rebalancing the economy towards consumption. That won't do very much for oil demand. But what I think is more likely is that they will do what they did in 2009 and 2010, which is to push a lot of money through the banking system that will spur investment. And if that happens, the demand for oil, I think, is going to remain pretty significant from China. Now, whether Chinese demand growth is going to be enough to make up for weaknesses in the rest of the world is unclear to me. If the US and the Eurozone and Japan stay very weak, I think it will be very difficult for China to maintain strength in the oil market all on its own. But in the oil market right now, I think supply factors have been playing a very important role until the last few weeks, because the very large run-up in prices was basically because of tensions in the Strait of Hormuz and so forth. So one interpretation I've heard from some people who watch the oil market more closely is that we are basically just seeing those supply tensions recede, and we're coming to a more balanced state of the oil market. So again, as a professor, I find it difficult to forecast interest rates and prices, including oil prices. But my sense is that given the weaknesses in demand, unless there is a major supply disruption because of political tensions around Iran, I think we'll see oil prices stay under 100 for the remainder of this year and possibly next year as well.
Let me ask you a last question. With this financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, many very prominent economists worldwide and policymakers have basically come to realize that some of the theories that they always thought were right were not actually right. Most notably, Alan Greenspan. Does the financial crisis have made any changes on the ways you saw things before, and what do you think has been the main realization that you've had from this crisis that you probably weren't expecting? Something that has changed from the way you approached things before as an economist.
So let me give you one very concrete example where the financial crisis has changed my view of things and also set me on a different research path. This is essentially about monetary policy, especially in emerging markets, because this is what I spend a lot of time doing research on. My sense had been that emerging market central banks in particular end up trying to do too much. They try to manage financial stability, they try to manage inflation, promote growth, manage the exchange rate, manage equity markets, and it's just too much for a central bank to do. Now, the reason for this is that in many emerging market central banks are the institutions with the best people, they're the most trusted, and they've delivered pretty good performance, at least on the inflation front. So my sense had been that emerging markets really should like other central banks in the West, try to think about inflation stability being the primary objective. It could be hard or soft inflation targeting, but basically have one core objective. But my view is increasingly that it's very difficult to separate out the price stability and financial stability objectives, that you need to have these two objectives trying to be met side by side with dual set of instruments. Now, that is a very complicated issue because it is going to open up central banks to a lot more political pressure. And it's not going to be easy to deal with that, especially in an emerging market context where de facto independence usually is lacking. But even if there is de facto independence, that independence really hangs by a thread. But I think the reality is that central banks are going to have to work in this much more politically and economically constrained environment. And how they do it is, I think, something that the academics need to give a lot more thought to. And this is certainly something where I think academia could do a lot better in terms of providing frameworks that are better at dealing with the messy realities of policy making in emerging markets.
Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. Okay.
Listo.